Welcome to this, the sixth talk in the series Genesis, the first three chapters. I'm going to start by reading verse 11 of Genesis chapter 1. Then God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees with seeds in it, according to their various kinds." And it was so. If, like me, you enjoy going for a country walk, then you're treated, or can be treated, to many delights: birds' song, or wonderful sights, a patchwork of fields. Around us there are fields with long grasses in some and open meadows in others. There are fields with various cattle, or occasionally we'll spot deer or raptors in the sky looking for their prey. The sights are wonderful, visual delights, and you hear wonderful sounds too. God saw his creation and declared it was good. In the 4th century BC, there was a famous Greek philosopher-scientist called Aristotle. He could be described as the father of early biology. He classified species, particularly along the shoreline, and in doing this he would be seeking to look for common features. Now, by today's standards, that was very rudimentary in terms of science. But the idea of grouping species was an encouraging first step. Now, even with my limited knowledge, I could differentiate between birds and mammals. And within the bird species, I could differentiate between sparrows and finches. And even with the sparrows, I could differentiate between, for instance, a house sparrow, a hedge sparrow, or a tree sparrow. Now, the Bible speaks of various kinds of species. If you go to the 5th stanza of Genesis chapter 1, in other words, the 3rd day of creation, you'll find that God creates seed-bearing trees and plants. It was in the text that I read to you. Now, there's no attempt here to differentiate between those plants which propagate through seed dispersal and those which don't, merely that plants generate new plants. An Oxford professor friend of mine once put it like this: does it not speak of the genius of God that he should create a world that creates itself? There was an Augustinian friar in the 19th century called Gregor Mendel. He did 10 years of work in the Moravian Abbey gardens where he lived and worked. Experimental work looking at common features in peas. Yes, the type you might get on your plate for dinner. He did pioneering work on genetics, and he wrote of the hidden factors which determined hereditary traits. We now know these to be genes. Another Christian, a scientist called Francis Collins, led the team which successfully mapped the human genome, that which distinguishes humans from others and common features in human after human. There is also remarkable work done by scientists called Watson and Crick, who, in their work on DNA and RNA, identified the chemical tools which relay genetic information. And they also produced that famous helical structure of DNA. I just want to read you a portion which captures those important elements. The work from Mendel to Collins and others shines a spotlight on features of genetic research over the recent 3 centuries. But in the first 3 chapters of Genesis, there is a teasing hint of classification even in a pre-scientific age. Self-generating creatures operate according to their various kinds. Some scientists, therefore, have described their work as thinking God's thoughts after him. And I suppose they might point to certain verses like this from Psalm 19, "The heavens declare the glory of God," or from Romans chapter 1, "God's invisible qualities can be perceived in his handiwork in creation." Now, to say this about seed-bearing plants generating other plants, to speak of a self-generating universe carries with it a potential trap. If God created a self-generating world, does this mean that it's a bit like a clock, which a clockmaker has wound up and left to run, and thereafter doesn't interfere, left to its own devices? That understanding is called Deism, and there are some atheists who will recognise that there is an intelligent mind behind this universe, who alone can account for creation, but they do not recognise a God who is currently involved in his world. So they will go for deism, but not theism, i.e. where God is currently involved in his world, sustaining it. So they would say it's been set up with various fine-tuned elements, universal constants which make sure it's just right for human flourishing, but there's no evidence of God now. That is not the Christian view. Historically, it's not sustainable. For instance, Jesus himself stepped into the world he had created. Emmanuel, that great nickname for Jesus, means God is with us. God has not just wound this thing up and left it to run. He is sustaining it day by day. Colossians 1 verse 7. Hebrews 1 and verse 3 speak of all things being currently held together by God. He sustains the world he has made. He is our creator and our sustainer. Let me read you something else on this theme. A loving God who is both creator and sustainer of all that he has made, we can say that he takes great pleasure in that which he has created. Within this universe there is predictable and orderly, self-sustaining, self-generating features which point to the genius of God. The various kinds and categories of God's creation, some of which are to be viewed on that country walk I spoke of, are good and are enriching well beyond their functional necessity. Now, a final point for you to ponder or discuss. Have you grasped the difference between deism and theism? A God who merely creates and leaves us to our own devices, or a God who is both our creator and our sustainer? It's an important point to grasp, to understand. And are you in danger ever of lapsing into that deism? Or do you know the God who both is your creator and your daily sustainer? Well, thank you for watching the 6th video in the series Genesis, the first 3 chapters.